Hello everyone and welcome back to Ruby Lessons in Codecademy. So today we're going to be looking at Lambdas, and as you remember in the last lesson we were looking at procs, and this whole topic is on things like that. So first of all we started by looking at blocks. So Lambdas are kind of similar to blocks, so as you can see, or as well as like procs. More like procs, but procs are also similar to blocks. You should probably watch the previous two videos I made just to get a sense of what they are. So like procs, lambdas are objects. As you remember, we did find out that lambdas or procs are objects in the last lesson. So the similarities do not stop there. With the exception of a bit of syntax and a few behavioral quirks, but lambdas are identical to procs. So this is a bit of a code that we are given here. So typing this is the same as typing this, and as you remember, this is how we make procs, and this is a new way that we're learning today of making lambdas. So in the example to the right, we are given a function here. Don't confuse this. The first four lines are not a lambda; they are a function or a method, as Ruby likes to call it. Do not confuse it. Even though it's called lambda demo, it is a method. It does, however, receive a lambda as an argument. So in the example to the right, when we pass the lambda to lambda demo, and our lambda is lambda puts I'm the lambda over here, because if we compare this to this, we will see the similarity. The method calls the lambda and executes its code. As you can see, puts I'm the method. As we discussed, this is a method, and then we call the argument .call, so the lambda.call. Okay, so now that you know how blocks and procs work, you should be able to guess what this lambda will put to the console. Click Save and Submit Code to confirm your suspicions. So what should happen, or what we should see in the console, is I'm the method followed by I'm the lambda, and then either end or nothing or nil should be printed out. There we go. And the method, and then the next line calls the lambda, which we have passed, and that calls I'm the lambda. Okay, so let's move on. Also, if you have any questions along any of the lesson, do feel free to ask in the comments down below. I will make sure to answer them as soon as possible. So, lambda syntax. Lambdas are defined using the following syntax. So you have lambda, the parameter, and then what you want it to do, the block, as it says here. So the block doesn't require another set of curly braces because we already have the curly braces in there. So consider this whole thing as a block, but before that you put the keyword lambda. So lambdas are useful in the same situations in which you would pass a proc. So we'll cover the differences between lambdas and procs in the next exercise. In the meantime, let's get a little practice in with the lambda syntax. So it's not that complicated, as you can see. Instead of just having a block, we put lambda and then the block. So we want to have an array of strings in the editor, but we want an array of symbols. We have an array of strings, but we want an array of symbols. On line 4, that is over here, create a new variable called symbolize. With the Z, okay, sure, why not? Store a lambda that does what? Let's see. That takes one parameter, so let's call this parameter a string, and calls .toSym on that parameter. So a string .to_sim, which converts whatever this is to a symbol, as we have done previously. So we will then use symbolize with the .collect method to convert the items in strings to symbols. So that, I believe, is doing that here. So write your code above this line. And then we do symbols equals strings.collect. Okay, so that goes through each of these. It's the same as going strings.each. And then and symbolize. Let's see. And as you can see, our output is what we expected it to be. It gives us symbols for each of the strings. So we have Leonardo as a symbol, not as a string. And we know it's a symbol because it has the colon in front of it. So we have done this before. I'm not going to go into too much detail. We're just doing it in a different way, using lambdas instead of blocks or procs. So moving on. Lambdas versus procs. So if you're thinking that procs and lambdas look super similar, that's because they are. So there are only two main differences. First, a lambda checks the number of arguments passed to it, while a proc doesn't. So this means that a lambda will throw an error if you pass it the wrong number of arguments, whereas a proc will ignore unexpected arguments and assign nil to any that are missing. So what that means is, for example, if you have a proc, proc.new, that is something like, let's leave a space there, this, A, B, and then you call this proc, let's actually assign it something like my proc equals that, and you call this proc with, I don't know, say 1, 2, and 3, what's going to happen is it's just going to ignore the 3. And if you were to call it with just 1, it's going to assign 1 to A to be equal to 1 and B to be equal to nil. I know this isn't the way of doing it, but I'm just trying to give you an example. Okay, so second, when a lambda returns, it passes control back to the calling method. But when a proc returns, it does so immediately without going back to calling the method. So to see how this works, take a look at the code in the editor. Our first method calls a proc. Okay, so that's a proc, and this is our lambda method, or the method that calls the lambda, and the second calls the lambda, okay? Instructions, click save and submit code to see the return values. So see how the proc says, okay, let's do that and see what happens. So it calls it right after it's defined. We have Batman, iron proc, it has no parameters. So Victor equals proc.new, it creates a new proc that is called Victor, and that proc returns Batman will win, and then it calls that. Then we also have Iron Man will win, and because even though we don't have a return statement here, it has an implicit return, and so that goes, let's actually see. So as you can see, what happens is that when we call the proc, it immediately doesn't call back to the method. It doesn't return to the method. It just ends. Whereas with a lambda, because this is just returned, it's not printed out, nothing actually happens, and then it returns back to the method, and the implicit return here returns this. And even though there is an implicit return in front of this, it doesn't return it. So just to show you what I mean, if we do, for example, puts hello here, we are not going to see that, as you can see. However, if we put it before the call, before our proc is called, we do see it, because, well, it hasn't been called and it follows on through. But when we do call it, it doesn't return back to the return control back to the method. Okay. So see how the proc says Batman will win. This is because it returns immediately without going back to the Iron Man proc method. So it doesn't go back to this. It doesn't return control, or it just returns immediately whatever is given to it, or whatever it does, and it skips out this step. However, a lambda does not skip out that step, and you can use this inside of this. So for example, if I wanted to, I could do my variable equal to .call, and I could put my variable. What I'm going to see is Batman will win twice, and then followed by Iron Man will win. So I can use the output of this. So that's quite good. I believe that is correct. Nope, that is not correct. I need to keep the call there. There we go. Save and submit. So let's move on. Now you try. Good. Great work, you've written your own lambda and seen how to pass it to a method. Now it's time for you to write a lambda and pass it to a method. So if you think this will be a lot like what you've already done with procs, you're exactly right. Just like with procs, we'll need to put an and symbol at the beginning of our lambda name when we pass it to the method, since this will convert the lambda into the block the method expects. So otherwise it's expecting like a variable, not this kind of an object. So that symbolized lambda was pretty cool. Let's riff on it with lambda and checks that with a lambda that checks to see if each element in an array is a symbol. So we're going to be checking this time instead of making it. We can do this checking with the .isA method, which returns true if an object is a type of an object and false otherwise. Okay. So we have hello is a, and then we follow it on with whatever we want it to be. So if I wanted to check for a string, I would put string there. Notice the capital first letter. And because in this case hello is a symbol, because of the colon, it returns true. So the word symbol has to be capitalized when you're doing the .isa check. Instructions: create a lambda symbol filter. Let's do that. Lambda that takes one parameter and checks to see if that parameter is a symbol. So what should we call that parameter? Let's call it from array, because I don't know what else to call it. We do .is underscore a question mark, and then we want to check if it's a symbol. Similarly, we could check if it's a string or not string, even in this case if we wanted to, because we only have strings and symbols, so it would give the same output as if we were checking for symbols. Just in this case, if we had a third type of variables, then it wouldn't give the same output. But just to stay on the safe side, I am going to stick to symbol. Okay. Create a new variable called symbols and store the result of calling myArray.select and passing it to your lambda. Store the result of calling my_array.select, passing it your lambda. So to do that, where is my AND symbol? There it is. Symbol filter, and this is just going to store the true and false value. So what we should get is false, true, true, false, false. Or no. Actually, it should be false, true, false, true, true, because we're checking for a symbol. And just to end it off with, I'm going to put it out, even though it's not asking to do that, just to make sure that we get what we expect to get, just for like a troubleshooting step. Okay. Okay, yeah. Select doesn't actually give us the true and false in this case. It just selects if it is true, then it adds it. If it isn't true, then it removes it. So we get kettles, we get mittens, and we get packages, which is what we expected to get because those are the symbols, and that's where it turns true, so it selects those to put into our symbols array. So moving on, quick review. So all this talk of blocks, procs, and lambdas might have your head spinning. Let's take a minute to clarify exactly what each one is. So if you want to a bit more detail, a bit more depth, I would recommend watching the previous two videos along with this one. But if you already have watched those or just want a bit of recap, keep on watching. A block is just a bit of code between do end or curly braces. It's not an object on its own, but it can be passed to methods like .each or .select. It can't be stored under a variable name, which is what procs and lambdas can be done, which is what procs and lambdas can do. So a proc is a saved block we can use over and over. So if you're doing a block multiple times, then you should consider naming it and then reusing it under that name, or under that variable name or object name in this case actually, because that's a more efficient way of doing it. And then a lambda is just like a proc, only it cares about the number of arguments it gets, and it returns to its calling method rather than returning immediately. So those are the only two differences we have covered so far. There are obviously lots of cases in which blocks, procs, and lambdas can do similar work, but the exact circumstances of your program will help you decide which one you want to use. So for example, if you only needed to use one block once, you should probably use a block and not a proc or a lambda. Even though it wouldn't really matter if you use the block or a proc or a lambda, but it depends on preference. So instructions: make sense good. When you're ready, click Save and Submit code to begin with the final review section. And that is going to be in the next lesson. We are just going to have a review of blocks, procs, and lambdas, as you can see over here. So thank you so much for watching this video. Again, if you have any questions, do feel free to ask in the comments down below. I will be happy to answer them as soon as possible. Other than that, if you enjoyed watching this video, please give me a like, share and subscribe. And until next time, thanks so much for watching once again, and goodbye.